They say acceptance is the stitch that pulls the wound closed. I tell them I am decorated in embroidery.
In June 2025, we were joined at the studio by Janae Lu and Zackary Mickelson for a conversation about Janae's experience as the 2024-25 Seattle Youth Poet Laureate, and to discuss her chapbook titled In All Spaces Liminal, published by Poetry Northwest Editions. Janae has been a member of SAL's Youth Poetry Fellowship program for the last 2 years, and Mr. Mickelson is her language arts teacher. Janae Lu is a writer whose work explores the nuances of transition, identity, and self-discovery through free verse poetry and creative prose. She is a junior at Tesla STEM High School, the chair of the Redmond Teen Advisory Board, and a second-year member of the Seattle Youth Poetry Fellowship. When not writing, she can be found doing endless amounts of homework, overanalyzing Taylor Swift lyrics, and adding to her forever-growing book collection. Zackary Mickelson is a first-year teacher at Tesla STEM High School, originally from Kirkland, Washington. Poetry is a passion of his, and he enjoys teaching poetry to his 10th and 11th graders. I'm Indira Dahlstrom, the Youth Programs Associate at Seattle Arts and Lectures. You're listening to SAL On Air, a collection of talks from the world's best writers from 37 years of Seattle Arts and Lectures, including this special showcase from our Youth Poetry Fellowship program. The Youth Poetry Fellowship serves a cohort of young writers committed to poetry, performance, civic and community engagement, education, and equity across the Puget Sound region. Now we'll hear an excerpt from In All Spaces Liminal. This is SAL On Air.
In All Spaces Liminal. Liminal is derived from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. It is a place of transition, a time of waiting and not knowing the future. It is a space between where you have been and where you will go, when what comes next is still uncertain. Liminality is not arrival or conclusion, but the state of becoming. This collection exists in that space, between past and future, present and absence, holding on and letting go. This first poem is inspired by a Mary Oliver line. The line is, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" which is the title for this poem, and it's also kind of a thesis statement for the overall book. And I came about this while I was reading Mary Oliver's book, The Summer Day, on an actual summer day, because I am exactly that person, and I underlined that one line immediately. And I don't know why, it just felt like she was calling to me because I don't know what I plan to do with my one wild and precious life. And this poem comes from that little panic spiral. It's the first one in the chapbook, and it really introduces the idea of liminality, not knowing what's next, being suspended in that weird space between one version of yourself and the next, which, to be honest, feels kind of like the national pastime of being a young person. Again, it's titled, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" After Mary Oliver. It is the hottest day of the year. The heat reaches its lazy body over the surface of all things. It's stagnant, but somehow stays moving. Small insects interrupt the stillness, their wings sending ripples, making leaves shudder. July is nearing expiration, and I am torn between feeling everything and not caring at all. There is so much time left. There is nothing left. It matters, and yet still it doesn't. I'm staring at a blue swatch of sky and imagining every option at once. I could stay here in the grass for a decade, spine parallel to the earth. I could be far away if I wanted. I could die in the next minute. I could live forever somewhere else. I could stand up, stretch, take the trash out, cut bangs, rearrange my bedroom, read a book, raise a child, feed it, nurture it, watch it grow, sit at a desk, stare at a screen, buy a sailboat, go to school, teach myself how to crochet, pluck a few words out from the brambles of my brain and arrange them into strings of sentences, loudly declare this is who I am, and try to convince myself it's honest. Something in me is telling myself to be gentle, that we don't need to know, we don't have to have a plan. But there is something else, something more urgent. It pounds like a pulse, like a timer. Hurry, please, this is all you have. This next poem's a little heavier. It's one of several poems in the book about my mother, who has unfortunately struggled with substance use. And when I was 15, I had to step away from that relationship for my own safety, which was devastating and complicated and also extremely necessary. And this poem was my attempt to put that language to a very specific kind of grief, what it means to lose someone who is still alive, and that liminal space between love and distance, between memory and survival is honestly what made me start writing in the first place. And I think this feeling, grieving someone while they still breathe, is much more universal than we talk about. So this one is called, They Tell You Your New Life Will Cost You Your Old One. But they never tell you your old one will still have half a heartbeat. The pulse is slow, but it is there. Your old life will scratch at your door like an abandoned animal, whimpering, a constant reminder that you left someone behind. It will find ways to creep into your peripheral like poison ivy, silent, evident, and untouchable. And they don't tell you there are still ways to return to it. You'll find her old bottle of perfume at the back of your closet, and the scent will shoot you back to 2 years ago. You'll meet strangers with her name and try not to feel unsettled as you shake their hands. The home you ran from is still standing. The mother you loved is still alive. And they always forget to mention the nights you'll spend cross-legged on your bedroom floor, surrounded by all the family photos you cut yourself out of. Staring at the U-shaped outline in the foreground, you'll wonder what it truly means to be better off. So, as previously mentioned, I go to a STEM school, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And I wrote this one in the middle of a biology lecture on neuroscience. And kind of per usual during these lectures, I was kind of half paying attention and just scribbling down notes. And I remember my teacher said that the human brain is 79 cubic inches in volume. And I immediately raised my hand and was like, "You're joking." And he wasn't. I was just in denial. And I just remember feeling astounded that our entire lives are compressible into 79 cubic inches. And that's kind of where I started for this poem. Then we kind of started talking about medical history and the history of lobotomies and, I don't know, weird stuff like that has always kind of fascinated me. So then a few days later, I just kept on thinking about both of those things, which quickly spiraled into existential dread, as many of my poems do. So this one is titled Lessons in Anatomy. 1. The human brain is 79 cubic inches in volume. Everything you have ever known fits into 79 cubic inches of headspace. 2. The first lobotomy was performed in 1946. Since then, there have been over 50,000 lobotomies in the U.S., and I have had dozens of them. In moments when I feel particularly unwell, I disconnect my frontal lobe and try to rearrange the clutter. I've been told it's supposed to help stabilize a personality. I can tell you I've been trying to map these 79 cubic inches for my entire life, and I still don't understand where I am. 3. There's something so incredibly lonely about the fact that our consciousness cannot be shared. So badly have I wanted to take a piece of myself and let another person carry it for a while, to make this load a little lighter, not to tell you, but to show you instead. 4. There's a special type of solitude that is found when you become trapped in your own skull. Think you are stranded on a desert island. Think you are lost in space. Think you are all you have. So this next poem was inspired by a song by Phoebe Bridgers, Garden Song. The lyric is, "The doctor put a hand over my liver and told me my resentment is getting smaller." And I draw a lot of inspiration from music. I really enjoy big lyricists like Phoebe Bridgers, Olivia Rodrigo, and Taylor Swift. And I was really drawn to this lyric in particular by the idea of the liver, which is a cleansing and detoxifying organ, being a marker for emotional healing. And that could be tracked medically, and what would progress look like if measured by a doctor's hand? And I think the idea of resentment shrinking like a symptom felt really powerful. So I wrote it down and then came back to it. Again, this one is titled, "The doctor put her hand over my liver and told me my resentment is getting smaller." After Phoebe Bridgers. It has been 3 years, or maybe 6 days, or maybe my entire eternity. I do not remember. The memory is eroding with everything else, shrinking, collapsing, like stars dying, drying up. After the resentment leaves, I am mostly empty space. In my peripheral, your wake looks gentle. You look best as blurred lines, approachable only as shapeless cool tones, with no harsh edges or pollution to forgive. They say acceptance is the stitch that pulls the wound closed. I tell them I am decorated in embroidery. The doctor ran her hands along my collection of tightened thread and told me my history is healing. It's been 3 years, or maybe 6 days, or maybe my entire eternity. I am forgetting, little by little. You are fading out, like stars dying, like a knot pulled finally tight.
And now we'll hear a conversation between Janae Lu and Zackary Mickelson.
Poetry can have many different relations to life, celebrating, healing, ranting, ordering, complicating. Is there one such connection between your life and an All Spaces Liminal that's important to these poems, whether that's to your personal history, school, or something else?
This book, in many ways, I think, is a record of becoming. And I don't mean that in some polished, inspirational way where I start as one person and end up somewhere neatly resolved. And if anything, I think the book documents the messier kind of becoming when you're growing and undoing and grieving and searching all at once. And I think for a long time, I didn't have a name for that space. It wasn't until I encountered the word liminal that I realized that's where I live and that's where I write from. Like you mentioned, this book is rooted in very specific parts of my personal history. There are poems in here about estrangement, about existential crises, about watching your peers move through life with ease where you feel like you're stuck in the vestibule. So, yes, it celebrates and rants and heals and questions, but more than anything, I think it observes and it tries to name what it means to exist in uncertainty.
Can you share an example of this becoming in one of the poems?
There's this moment in the first poem, the Mary Oliver one, Tell Me What It Is You Plan to Do with Your One Wild and Precious Life, where I'm listing all of these potential futures, which range from the mundane, rearranging my bedroom, or teaching myself how to crochet, to raising a child. And I think that passage is so reflective of how my brain works, and I'm constantly just flickering between options, unable to land, equally drawn to and terrified by all of them. And that's what youth feels like to me, or maybe just my consciousness in general.
I love how your answer to that question comes back to the title of the collection and how that title has such a strong sense of purpose for the poems. Moving to questions about influences and the writing process, what first led you to write poetry, and how has your work evolved and been shaped by life since then?
Well, this is going to be a really long answer, but I love this question because I get to say something I don't often admit, which is that I used to hate poetry, like not just dislike it, I actively resented it, and I think I had the common experience of being forced to write poems in elementary and middle school. And I remember in 6th grade, I had to write a poem for English class. And I wrote about how stupid poetry was. And I read it very proudly out loud to the class, like some sort of like preteen protest artist. And I don't know, for years, I think I just saw poetry as this pretentious exercise as in saying as little as possible, using as many metaphors as possible. And I didn't get it. I didn't want to get it. And I think, as I got to maybe like summer before high school, I started reading a lot more classic literature and getting kind of into that. And just because I was so surrounded by like the Victorian Romantic era, poetry was inevitably on my radar. And I think maybe my contempt softened to indifference, but I was still not actively seeking it out. And this all changes on February 9th, 2023. And I remember the exact date because it truly reoriented something in me. I was a freshman and I was researching for this English project, and I wanted to print this really long academic journal. And I think it was like over 100 pages. It was really unnecessary. So I was asking around for teachers who would let me use the printer, and no one would let me print. And that's like very reasonable. But my computer science teacher offered to do it during office hours. So I'm sitting in his room and I'm waiting for this gigantic document to print. And while I'm waiting, someone is reading a poem out loud. And that poem is about generational trauma and injustice. And I just froze. Also, that person was Adzi Kona, who was in the Youth Poetry Fellowship a few years ago. And I just have to name him every time someone asks about my writing journey because I genuinely cannot understate how pivotal he has been in my writing journey. He was the one who encouraged me to apply for the laureate and the fellowship. He helped me edit the chapbook. He's coached me through every reading. But, I'd never heard poetry like that before, and I didn't know it could do that, and I didn't know it was allowed to do that. So I went home and I wrote a few lines on the back of an envelope, which in hindsight is very like Dickinson, but it wasn't even meant to be a poem, but it just felt like breathing. And I think I'd been waiting for a way to process everything I was feeling, and suddenly I had one. And then as I started writing more, that also led me to go to local open mics in Redmond. And I remember my first time performing, I was reading a poem about my mom, and I was so terrified. I remember my hands were shaking so much I thought I might drop the paper. And I was also like whispering into the mic because I didn't want to be heard. And I hated public speaking, and someone in the front row asked me to speak up, and they said, "We want to hear you." And I think that moment unlocked something. It was the idea that my voice could be wanted, that it wasn't a burden, and that was really huge for me.
Wow, it's great to hear about the people and communities that have served as guides and catalysts in this journey. I think it's a common misconception that poetry is entirely solitary work. But some of the people and relationships that underlie poetry can be more complicated. And in your introduction to They Tell You Your New Life Will Cost You Your Old One, you spoke about moving away from your relationship with your mother. How did poetry empower you in this process, even as it involved holding on to some things, putting them on the page, and sharing them aloud?
Well, for a long time, I think I was just surviving in that relationship. And when you're in survival mode, there's not a lot of space for reflection. You're managing, trying to stay ahead of the next mess, trying to make sure everything looks okay from the outside. And I used to lie and say that things were fine, and they really weren't. And, I was also lying to myself. Obviously, denial is a really big part of addiction, but I feel like we don't talk enough about how denial extends to loved ones, and I think that's where I was. I was constantly avoiding it and just pretending everything was fine. And then once I started writing, which, like I said, at first wasn't even intentional, that was just because I needed somewhere to put it. But I think eventually I started to understand that the act of writing wasn't just so much even about the release as it was about recognition. It gave me like this mirror, and what I saw in that mirror helped me realize that the life I was living wasn't sustainable, that there was more to me than being someone who cleaned up and covered the chaos of someone else, and that my future didn't have to be built around someone else's damage. And that gave me the strength to leave. And then, for the question of sharing, I think that's always been really difficult for me. When you grow up with someone who struggles with substance abuse, there's this implicit family role or roles you learn very early on, which is don't feel, don't trust, don't talk. And silence becomes survival. But poetry is the exact opposite of that. Poetry is feeling, it's trusting your perspective, it's talking, and often talking loudly, honestly, and without apology. So every time I shared a poem, especially the ones about my mother, it felt like I was breaking that rule. But I've learned that breaking that rule didn't break me. And in fact, I think it's been a big part of what's allowed me to start healing.
It's incredible to hear about how poetry helped you create a new rule to replace that rule of silence, a rule that centers healing and expressing your voice. Noticing how science runs through this chapbook, from physics to anatomy, how has attending Tesla STEM High School and studying these subjects also shaped your approach to poetry?
I think attending a STEM school definitely has its benefits and challenges. I think the biggest drawback for me is the sense of isolation I felt in a school that really doesn't have any writing community. I think, like you said, people tend to think that writing is this solitary affair, and I really don't believe that at all. There are open mics and workshops and writing circles and just in general, a lot of opportunities to meet new people and different types of work to engage with and different ways to learn. But I think going to a school where that writing community isn't built in through like poetry clubs or poetry dedicated classes, it can begin to feel alienating as like a writer or a creative, especially when it feels like everyone around you is going in kind of an opposite trajectory from you. But that being said, I remember one other teacher telling me that Tesla STEM is not a death sentence. And I think that's so true. There are other ways to find community, and going to STEM just means, I've actively sought that out. And I'm so incredibly lucky to live in Seattle, or at least close enough that I can access the really rich and abundant literary community here. And programs like the Youth Poetry Fellowship have given me that literary community of young writers and countless other opportunities. And I think being involved in the broader Seattle literary community, I've gotten to meet so many new people from more backgrounds than I would have in kind of the bubble that is a high school. And like I said, there are so many benefits of going to STEM. Science specifically has been a really big part of my work, and that's been since the beginning just because that's what I'm constantly surrounded by. And it's something that I genuinely love. I think for some reason, since I write poetry and I plan to major in English, people think that I must dislike going to STEM. And yes, STEM isn't the field I plan on pursuing past high school, and sure, I've had to take required STEM classes that I've been less than thought about, but I've still found so much beauty in scientific concepts, and I really love to make them into larger narratives. I think there's a very common idea that STEM and the humanities are incompatible, but I don't think this to be true at all. I think both disciplines search for meaning, order, and understanding, and yes, the tools may differ, but the questions at the core are fundamentally the same. And for me, writing about science helps bridge these worlds and allows me to translate scientific discovery into something that's very human.
Those parallels you've drawn are amazing. As the Seattle Arts and Lectures Youth Poet Laureate, you've had the opportunity to meet a few renowned writers. Is there something you learned from a SAL speaker that has influenced you as a poet?
Well, I think the fact that I can even answer this question is still completely surreal to me. These are writers I read before I ever knew I'd have the possibility to be in the same room as them, let alone open for them and have the opportunity to ask and get advice from them. Most recently, I got to open for Ada Limon, which, again, is just so crazy to me because I remember my mentor, Adi, showing me Ada Limon poems from The Hurting Kind and thinking, God, I want to write like this. And then later I got, the email asking if I'd like to open for her. And I think I, genuinely lost my mind. The fact that, I got to sit in the green room and talk about poetry with the National Poet Laureate is just absolutely wild to me. And it's not something that I take lightly. The one specific thing that she said to me that really stuck was, poems don't need to be answers. They can just be places to rest. And I remember after writing that down and feeling almost emotional, just because I had always treated poetry like this puzzle I had to solve. But she reminded me it could also just be a quiet room where you just are. And I think another memorable author interaction I had was when I met Percival Everett backstage. And I was so nervous, but he was so kind and humble and down to earth, and he even wanted a signed copy of my poem, which, for SAL lectures, they typically print out 20 copies of the opening poem and you sign them, and it's really exciting. So I immediately just ran out to the lobby to grab one, and when I was handing it to him, I spilled coffee all over the top edge of the page, and I was mortified. I was panicking and apologizing, and he just looked at me and said, completely deadpan, "Good. Now it has character." And, it made me laugh in the moment, but it also really stuck with me because I think there's something very poetic in that, the idea that the mess makes the work more human and that imperfection isn't just okay, it's honest. And I think that's helped me stop obsessing over every comma when I write.
Those are such surprising tidbits, and they feel like a gift of a nugget of gold. I'm sure those are things you'll take with you forever. I'd like to ask a few questions about some of the poems you've read and some of the lines and features in them that stood out to me. Mm-hmm. First of all, some of your metaphors feel so effortlessly appropriate, as if they are the only right way to express a thought. In general, how do you find these metaphors?
Honestly, a lot of them start as accidents. I'll be on the bus in class and some strange phrase will pop into my head and I'll jot it down before I forget. And I actually keep a running list of metaphors on my phone, or just like in random notebooks. And some are weird, some are kind of dark or a little cliche, but every once in a while, one will just fit.
I love the idea that they start as accidents, but I noticed you said start. One metaphor that struck me, and the doctor put her hand over my liver, is they say acceptance is the stitch that pulls the wound closed. I tell them I am decorated in embroidery, which falls beautifully under the initial comparison of your liver and resentment and is carried until the very last line, which closes the thought, you are fading out, with like a knot pulled finally tight. Just how carefully wrought are these metaphors, not to spoil the magic? Well, you said you find yourself inspired by things you encounter everyday life, but do the best ones have another source?
I think revision is where those ideas become fully formed metaphors. For that poem specifically, I think I had the phrase, acceptance is a stitch that pulls the wound closed, kind of jotted down. And then when I was actually writing the poem, I kind of asked, what else would the stitch look like? What happens if that stitch isn't medical but decorative? And that's where the line, I'm decorated in embroidery, came from. And it's about healing, but it also carries a question of performance, like what happens when your trauma becomes something visible or even beautiful. And that contrast really matters to me. I like when metaphors complicate things rather than resolve or find a clear-cut answer. I also think poetry is one of the few places where you can hold science and metaphor in the same hand. The liver metaphor started with the Phoebe Bridgers song, yes, but it was also a conversation with biology. The liver is this organ that is cleansing and detoxifying, but what would it mean for resentment to be stored there and to shrink like an actual symptom? I wanted that metaphor to carry all the way through, medically, metaphorically, and emotionally, and I work really hard to build metaphors that unfold across the poem rather than just flashing and disappearing.
Each of the poems you read today uses the second-person pronoun you, and this can be an enigmatic yet powerful multifunctional word in poetry, and its use seems to shift between these poems from reader to someone that can be inferred to be the speaker of the poems and maybe just an important third person. How do you approach the use of this pronoun? How singular versus multitudinous is the you in your poems?
Oh, you is everybody and nobody. Sometimes it's me, an older version of me, a scared version. Sometimes it's someone I've lost or someone I'm afraid to confront directly, like my mother. And sometimes it's the reader, and especially when I want a poem to feel like a kind of whisper or dare, I think you lets me hide and reach out at the same time. But it's never just one thing. I like that you can be both intimate and anonymous. And in some poems, it's a direct address, as if I'm holding a letter that I'm never going to send. And in others, it's more of an emotional placeholder, someone I want to forgive, or someone I miss, or someone I want to reach out to without having to confront them face to face. In the poem, they tell you your new life will cost you your old one. For example, the you shifts constantly. Sometimes it's me or my mother or the reader or memory or regret, and it holds all of that at once. And I hope that by keeping you as nobody and everybody at the same time, it can be more universal and people can take this poem into their own life and have their own you.
On craft, many of your poems organize and pace ideas with intentional line breaks, stanza breaks, and other visual elements. You've also performed your poetry before large audiences and written poems specifically for spoken delivery. How do you balance the demands of poetry's different formats, oral and printed, And has preparing in All Spaces Liminal changed your thinking about that?
Well, I like to think of it as like choreography in sheet music, which is another metaphor, I guess. Performance has rhythm and the gesture, and there's breath and body and presence. Then, the page has its own kind of music, visual pacing, white space, and kind of the way that like a line break can turn a sentence into a question. But this chapbook was actually the first time I had to think really seriously about how a poem looks when no one's reading it aloud, since most of my earlier work was written to be heard at like open mics, for example. And when I'd write, I'd also be planning things like tone and pacing and what I would do with my hands. And when I was first writing the collection, I think some of that crept in. I was still writing lines that depended on me being there to deliver them. I think once I got to the editing stage, I kind of started to realize that the page doesn't come with my voice and it has to work without me. So I began writing for silence and started thinking more about how a stanza break could mimic a breath or how an M dash could signal hesitation. And I kind of just started spacing things out. And it definitely felt strange at first, kind of like maybe like relearning a language I already spoke. But I think it ended up making me overall a stronger writer. But like that said, I still want poems to have rhythm. Even if you're reading it like in bed silently, I still want you to feel the pulse. And that's what I mean by music. The poem should breathe on its own, whether or not I'm in the room to read it.
The publication of this chapbook is an exciting beginning for wider readership of your poetry, and also the culmination of a Sal Laureateship that has already put you and your work before so many new audiences. Yet, the origin story of your poems is incredibly personal. Now, having experience with poetry as part of both private and public life, spoken and written, going forward, what do you think the act of writing poetry will mean to you?
Well, I think I'll start with this. I'm not going to stop writing, and honestly, I don't think I could. Writing is very much still my way of processing the world, and I've tried to take breaks, especially after like big deadlines. And those last like 2 days and really feels more like punishment than a break. Just because I feel it doesn't even feel voluntary. I feel this like compulsion to write things down. So I think forcing myself to not do that really just makes me like more anxious. But I think the realization that In All Spaces Liminal is being published has been quite terrifying, if I'm being honest, but also really cathartic. Like you said, this chapbook is deeply personal. It talks about my mother, my fears, my insecurities, my dreams, and just all my stories. And I remember after I sent off my final manuscript feeling both proud and like I might throw up, because like this chapbook is basically my diary. And I think there's a kind of vulnerability you can't really prepare for, even if you are the one who chose it. However, I've had people come up to me after readings and say, I felt this, or I didn't know how to say it until now. And I think that makes the vulnerability worth it for me. And that's what I want poetry to be, something that reflects the self, but also reaches beyond it. And, that all said, I think I am going to be scaling back on my commitments at least a little next year. Senior year is a lot and college applications are like a part-time job. But I've still got some really exciting readings coming up this summer and fall, and I'm so excited to see where I keep going with writing and see where it takes me.
I hope it isn't a stretch to say that this may have been the most exciting year in poetry for you. What has been the single best part of your Sal Laureateship experience?
Ooh, I think I've had so many amazing moments through Seattle Youth Poet Laureate program, but if I had to pick one, just one, I think the one that stands above all the rest would be performing my poem Too Good at Benaroya Hall. And that venue has been my dream since freshman year. I remember walking past it in downtown Seattle and thinking, maybe one day. So when I found out I'd be reading there, it didn't even feel real. And on top of that, it was Abraham Verghese speaking, and he is someone whose work I'd admire for so long, but never imagined I'd share a stage with his. And his lecture was just breathtaking. It was insightful and generous and human, and it just made the whole night feel 10 times more magical. I performed a poem called Too Good, which is about the way society teaches women and girls to be polite and accommodating and self-sacrificing, even in the face of danger. And it was a poem I put a lot of myself into, and it just felt right to share it in a space that big and that full of people. And another thing that made it really special was I had invited friends and mentors and teachers and people who have really shaped me, and they all showed up. And I remember finishing the last line, and there was this moment of quiet before the audience started clapping, and then people started to stand, and I looked over and I saw these people I love standing too, and it was overwhelming in the best possible way. Like this kind of I made it moment, and not because I was on a big stage, but because people I care about were there and bearing witness to it. And after, I remember people from the audience coming up to me and saying the poem reminded them of something they'd experienced. And then also, a few weeks later, I got an email from someone who had been in the crowd and they'd written a poem inspired by mine. And I honestly I don't have words for what that meant to me. That's the part of poetry that still leaves me in awe. The way it ripples, the way it connects people beyond just the performance. But being the Seattle Youth Poet Laureate has meant more to me than anything I've ever been a part of. It gave me a platform, but so much more than that. It gave me moments like that night at Benaroya and moments that felt like home and hope and history all in one. And I'm just so deeply, overwhelmingly grateful that I get to do this.
Yeah, amazing. And you touched tonight on finding the courage in other people encouraging and supporting you in putting your voice out there and sharing your poems and, physically sharing them by reading them aloud. Is there any word of advice you would give to encourage someone who writes or wants to write but is hesitant to actually share their words?
Well, I think before I give any advice, I should preface with, I've been doing it for 2 years, so I'm not a professional. But, I think if you want to get involved in sharing your work in a community, what kind of gets you there is just showing up. The first time I ever brought a friend to an open mic to share, she didn't even read a poem. She just kind of was in the space and got to meet people and see other people do it. And then that kind of gave her confidence. So I think just showing up, even if you're not going to share, can bring you the confidence to do it. And I also think, if you can, like I said, going with somebody can be quite helpful. And then, beyond things like open mics and in-person events, I've known people who share their poetry kind of anonymously online. And that's a really great way for them to get feedback without having to, potentially expose very vulnerable parts of themselves.
Those are some great tips. Thank you again, Janae.
Thank you for doing this.
Yes, I can't wait to buy a copy of an All Spaces Liminal and buy more copies to give out to people. This has been a delight. Thank you.
It was a delight to feature this conversation between Janae Lu and Zackary Mickelson. If you enjoyed listening, we welcome you to join us in person or online for our next season of events, or to check out more information about our Writers in the Schools and Youth Poetry Fellowship programs at lectures.org. Thank you to the Seattle Arts and Lectures staff, board, and community. And thanks to all of you for listening. This show would not be possible without you. Our show is produced by Jack Straw Cultural Center, with theme music by Daniel Spills. To hear more, subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, rate and review us 5 stars so that more people can enjoy Sal on Air.